with this seemingly simple request, and it is completely plausible that Decius's idea of getting back on the good side of the gods had nothing to do with sacrifices at all, but instead had everything to do with the complete suppression of Christianity. The mechanics of the edict were simple. A magistrate would announce that everyone in his municipality had, say, 30 days to offer the proper sacrifices, and then you would be issued a ticket after having performed said sacrifices. The officials would then come around after the 30 days were up and make sure everyone had their ticket, and if you didn't have it, well, that was treason, and treason meant torture and death. Across the empire, Christians heard about the edict, immediately recognized it as being totally incompatible with their belief system, and tried to figure out what exactly they were going to do. Some broke right away, made the necessary sacrifices, and either left Christianity behind forever, or asked for forgiveness after the fact. But most refused, and hoped that the Roman authorities would not pursue any heavy-handed reprisals. What was the big deal if a few Christians didn't take part in these pagan rituals? They paid their taxes and kept out of trouble, and for the last few years that had been more than enough to keep them flying below the imperial radar. But Decius had no intention of pursuing a policy of toleration, and when the first batch of Christians let time expire without making a sacrifice, Decius recommended to the local authorities that they go ahead with the torture and the executions. Like a wave spreading across the empire, defiant Christians were rounded up and killed as the deadline for sacrificing came and went in each new province. Over the course of 250, thousands of Christians, both prominent and obscure, were executed, including Pope Fabian, who set the tone for the faithful by accepting martyrdom at the end of January 250, not long after the edict was first issued. Perhaps revealing what this was all really about, Decius then prevented the Christians from electing a new bishop of Rome, and the office remained vacant until the emperor left the capital to go fight the Goths 18 months later. Not to get too far off into ecclesiastic history, but when a new pope finally was elected again, it set off a minor schism within the church over the question of how exactly to treat those Christians who had made the sacrifices and now wanted to return to the church. Did they need to be rebaptized, or was sincere repentance enough? And this was a heavy question that caused a great deal of angry debate. So, while not succeeding in eliminating Christianity, Decius did do much to sow some serious discord within the church. While the persecution of Christians raged across the empire, Decius made a play to further reintroduce the Romans to the virtuous ways of their forefathers by reviving the office of censor. But rather than claiming the title for himself, as previous emperors had done, Decius picked a man he thought worthy of the job, and offered Publius Licinius Valerianus the opportunity to lead Rome's moral revival. But Valerian, as we know him today, thought long and hard about the offer, and in the end, risked the wrath of the emperor by declining to take the job. Not only was the task shaping up to be an impossible one, hey, you see that water over there? Make it run uphill, okay? But the censorship was, when you read the fine print, an incredibly powerful office. To don the title of censor would be to don a title that would make Valerian practically the equal of Decius, and that was a very dangerous place to be. He could see that in time, that kind of power would probably make Decius violently paranoid, even if it had been his idea to begin with. Valerian was a smart guy. The job was impossible, and the position was just too dangerous. No good could come of it, so he declined. He told Decius that the office was too august to be held by anyone but the Augustus himself, and asked instead for a regular old military posting in Germany. Decius granted the request and let Valerian slip away with his head intact. We do not know whether the emperor planned to let the matter drop completely, or whether he was dead set on bringing the censor back to Rome, because shortly after Valerian's refusal, the Goths once again invaded the empire, bringing an end to Decius's experiments with public virtue. In late 250, a Gothic king named Cniva that's the pronunciation I'm going with, led an army across the Danube and began running amok in Thrace and Moesia. Though we call this army the Goths, they were actually a far more cosmopolitan force than the name suggests. Cniva raised a standard that Germans and Sarmatians, and even a healthy number of Roman deserters flocked to. So while we call them the Goths, remember that a number of different nationalities all fought for Cniva, not just the Goths themselves, though they were the thick trunk of the invading army. Cniva's forces overran the border defenses easily, which was what prompted so many Roman soldiers to desert, and after extracting a large payment from Marcianopolis not to sack their city, the Goths were soon laying siege to the city of Nicopolis. Provincial leaders begged Decius to personally lead a relief army to evict these most unwelcome guests, and Decius, recognizing how dire the situation was, immediately began preparations for the march north. In early 251, he was on his way along with his 24-year-old son Herennius, who Decius had induced the Senate to make his co-Augustus shortly before their departure. This new father and son team was supposed to destroy the Goths and then go on to found a great new dynasty. But instead what happened is that they both died and went down in history as the first emperors to fall in battle against a foreign enemy. Now the Persians will tell you that that honor really belongs to Gordian III, but let's not concern ourselves with that for now. The Goths had not taken Nicopolis by the time Decius and his reinforcements arrived, so Cniva abandoned the siege and headed off for greener pastures. But for the Romans, this was not about simply coming to the aid of Nicopolis. It was about throwing the Goths out of the empire entirely. So Decius and his army pursued Cniva across the countryside. No slouch when it came to strategy and tactics, and decided to use their headlong charge against them. Decius was pushing his troops hard on the assumption that Cniva was running as fast as he could, but what the Gothic king was actually doing was turning his army around and pointing them straight back at the unsuspecting legions. Believing the Goths to be nowhere near them, the Romans set up camp for the night, and though guards were of course posted, no one was expecting to be doing any fighting for at least a couple of days. But then, out of nowhere, the full Gothic army appeared over a hill and came barreling at the Roman position. Caught completely off guard, Decius tried to keep his men in line, but the shock of the attack scattered the legions, and the subsequent retreat involved a lot more running than the emperor probably would have liked. Satisfied that he had spooked the Romans off the chase, Cniva then headed off to the nearby city of Philippopolis, which he planned to sack before the Romans were able to regroup. The Goths were, after all, here to plunder the wealth of the empire, not engage the legions in unproductive battles. But by not following up on his surprise attack, Cniva allowed Decius time to reform his embarrassed army. The emperor rebuilt their confidence by leading them against a series of much smaller German forces who were attempting to join Cniva's invincible army, and pretty soon they were feeling okay about themselves again. Cniva's invincible army, though, was only invincible when fighting in head-to-head battles. When it came to laying siege to cities, they lacked the kind of sophisticated equipment necessary to do the job right, and the siege of Philippopolis, like the siege of Nicopolis, took longer than it was supposed to. And while the Romans regained their strength, Cniva saw the strength of his own army slowly slipping away. But eventually, the citizens of Philippopolis could hold out no longer, and they were forced to surrender their city. In the subsequent sack, it is reported that 100,000 men, women, and children were killed. Cniva, emboldened, then grabbed Titus Julius Priscus, the governor of Thrace, who may or may not have been in on the whole thing and been the one who betrayed Philippopolis to the Goths, and proclaimed Priscus emperor of the Roman Empire under the generous protection of the Gothic king. This attempt to seize the empire in one fell swoop was short-lived, though. Not only did Priscus die shortly after becoming emperor, cause of death unknown, but Decius and his reinvigorated army arrived on the scene and slowly began to surround the Gothic position. Aware that the siege had depleted his forces dangerously, Cneva decided it was time for the Goths to make their getaway. They piled their carts high with accumulated treasure and made a run for the northern border. Confident both in his numerical superiority and just the superiority of the legions in general, Theseus chased down the fleeing Goths and made every effort to fight them as soon as possible. A decisive battle would prove to the Goths that messing with Rome got you nowhere, and would prove to the Romans themselves that the dominance of the legions was still a matter of fact, not a matter of imagined reputation. But boy did he wind up proving just the opposite. The mistake Theseus made was that he was so eager to engage the Goths that he basically ceded the decision of where the battle would take place to Cneva. The Gothic king chose a spot just south of the Danube near the town of Abritus, and arranged his men in 3 lines, strategically positioning the 3rd line just behind some marshy swampland, so that the front Gothic ranks kept the site screened from the Romans. I won't say that the battle was already decided before the first spear was tossed, but allowing Cneva to pick the time and the place of the battle was a fatal blunder. Remember, kids, if there is one thing the history of warfare has proven again and again, it's that, like real estate, the name of the game is location, location, location. Don't let your enemy pick the battle site. Chances are the spot he will pick is a spot that complements his strengths and negates yours. If he offers battle someplace you're not sure of, avoid the temptation to fight it out, and instead focus on drawing him into a spot of your choosing. I can promise you, you will like the results a whole lot better. Just ask Theseus. According to legend, the Battle of Abritus started ominously for the Romans, as Herennius was struck by an arrow and killed in the opening minutes of the fight. Theseus, however, used the shocking death of his son as a way to rally his men, crying out, "Let no one mourn. The death of one soldier is no great loss to the Republic." This stirring scene is of course apocryphal, but I figured I'd pass it along since that was the way the Romans told the story to each other. Regardless, the moment was soon forgotten as the legions plunged into the damp hell that awaited them in front of that 3rd Gothic line. The legions pushed the Goths back, and pushed the Goths back, and pushed the Goths back, leaving the Romans with the impression that the battle was now going great. The 1st Gothic line broke, and then the 2nd gave way, and the Romans pursued the fleeing barbarians with reckless abandon, sure that victory was just within their grasp. But the legions pursued the fleeing Goths right into the marshlands, and right into Cneva's trap. Bogged down in the marsh, the Romans were surrounded by the last Gothic line. A fierce combat followed, but the terrain was too much for the Romans to overcome, and the battle turned into a slaughter. Theseus himself disappeared in the fighting, and his body was never recovered from the swamp. He was 50 years old, and had ruled the empire for 2 years. The governor of Upper Moesia, a general named Trebonianus Gallus, was left in command of the remnants of the Roman army, and soon after the battle, he negotiated a peace with Cneva. The Goths would be allowed to leave Roman territory unmolested with all the treasure they had accumulated, which, yeah, it's not like the Romans could have stopped Cneva from doing anything he wanted anyway. But the Roman general also worked out a deal that would pay Cneva an annual tribute in exchange for the Gothic king agreeing to stay out of Roman